Hi, kindergarten, good morning. Here's the note catcher that you need for today, front and back. Okay, we're starting a new unit today that's called Colonial Towns and Townspeople. So over the next few weeks, you'll be learning about what life was like in America hundreds of years ago. And back then, people made most of the things that they needed at home. Living back then meant doing a lot of work, and even the children had to help by doing chores every day. What chores do you have? Talk to your family about it. What responsibilities do you have? Have you ever cooked before? Do you ever take care of your pets? Have you ever washed the dishes? Today's Read Aloud will describe a lot of the chores that a family would have done hundreds of years ago on a farm in the country. Over the next few days, students will be learning about towns or places where farmers could go to buy things that would make life easier at home. So right now, where do you go to buy your food or to buy your clothes? You probably go to a grocery store like maybe Pete's Market or Jewel. For your clothes, maybe you go to Walmart or Target. Well, they didn't have those places back then. Back then, they had a place called a town that you could go to, and they had a bunch of shops that you could go to. Okay? And these shops were only found in towns, and sometimes these towns were very far away from where a farmer lived in the country. Some large towns had lots of different shops, but most towns were small and often only had one shop. And the one shop would carry just about every type of good that a farmer could need, like flour, cloth, seeds, and tools. Unlike today's stores where you would pay with money to buy things, back then farmers would bring things from their farm, like maybe crops or milk or eggs, and they would trade these things with the people who owned the shops. And that was called bartering. Say bartering. So, hundreds of years ago, if you lived in a town, it was kind of like a mini city where all of the buildings and houses were closer together. But if you lived out in the country, all the houses were very far apart, and there was lots of like fields of crops and things like that. So you would have to drive quite a far away to get into town to do this. So over the next few weeks, you're going to learn about tradespeople who had special jobs like making clothes or building houses. Farmers liked going to town because tradespeople made and sold things that farmers needed so they didn't have to make them at home. A farmer went to town for a lot of the same reasons that we would go to a store today. Okay, so over the next few weeks, I will be reading you stories about people who lived in America a long time ago. Okay, and I just want to give you a little reminder of what we've learned so far. So I made this timeline for you here. We learned that the first people to live in America were called the Native Americans, and we learned a lot about different Native American tribes like the Lakota Sioux and the Wampanoag tribe. Okay, and they lived here for hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus decided to get on his ships and travel there in 1492. And remember, he didn't even know that America existed. He thought that he was going to the Indies. Okay, so that was in 1492. And then about 100 years later, we had the Pilgrims. They came from a place called England on a ship called the Mayflower. And they traveled for 2 months to get to America. And once they got there, they decided to form their own little towns. The first town they formed was called Plymouth Colony. They formed all these little colonies where they built their own houses. They built different shops or schools. They started growing crops, things like that. And so where we're at now is about 80 years later in 1700, once these colonial towns really started getting formed. That's what we're going to learn about today. Okay? So this is called the country family. Today we're going to take an imaginary trip back in time about 300 years ago to an early American farm. If you lived in the country long ago, you and your family did most of the work necessary for survival right at home. In the country, houses were far apart from one another, so you couldn't rely on neighbors or stores to get everything you needed. You had to make most things at home. Everything you needed: food to eat, water to drink or use for cooking and cleaning, lighting to help you see after dark, heat when it turned cold, and clothing required a lot of work by the family. Even young children had to help out because there was so much work to do. There was no electricity for lamps or lights, and there were no flashlights. The only way to see anything after it got dark was to light candles that you made at home. Okay, so if you were alive hundreds of years ago, you wouldn't be able to just walk into a room and flip a switch and a light would turn on. Back then, once it got dark, people would light candles to give them light after dark. Okay? Or they could use light from a fire. So your first question says, or your first question for you to think about with your family is, long ago there was no electricity, so what did farmers use for light to see at night? I know I just said it, but I want to make sure you're with me and paying attention. What did farmers use to see at night? Okay, shout it out loud. I hope you remember. Also, there were no electric ovens or stoves like we have today. So you had to build a fire to heat your home and cook your meals. That brings us to our first question on our note catcher. It says, long ago there were no furnaces to heat houses. How did people keep their houses warm? What did they use? So you could say they would blank. Okay, pause the video please if you need to. Okay, there were also no sinks or faucets with running water inside the house. So right now, if you needed water, you could probably walk into your kitchen and turn up the faucet and water would come out. Or you could go into the bathroom and do that. Or you could maybe you have a hose in your backyard or your front yard. It's very easy to get water, right? But if you would have been alive hundreds of years ago, you couldn't have done that. Instead, you had to fetch or go get any water you needed for drinking, cooking, or cleaning from a creek or a well outside. And excuse me. Parents, I know a lot of your kids probably don't know what a well is, so you might want to look for a YouTube video that would explain a little bit of what that is. Okay, and that goes to your next question. It says, long ago there were no sinks or faucets, so how did people get water? What did they do? All right. There were no malls with clothing stores, so you had to make your own clothes. There were no supermarkets, so you had to grow your own vegetables. You had to milk your own cows, and you had to make your own cheese. Imagine doing all that work every day. Okay? At the start of a typical day in the country, the first thing a woman did was fetch wood to start the fire in the hearth or fireplace. The hearth was the most important place in the home. Most of the chores to be done required fire. And especially in the winter, everyone needed to stay close to the hearth because it provided the only heat in the house. Okay, so in this picture, this is the hearth or the fireplace. Okay, so that was very important in the house. After building the fire, a country woman would most likely start her day by baking bread. Sometimes she would make her own flour by grinding corn kernels or wheat into a fine powder. Then she would mix this flour with water or yeast and let it rise for several hours. The dough would then be put in an iron pot with a tight lid and hung over the hearth to bake or cook. Okay, so right here you can see the dough from the bread, the dough that she's using. Okay. And one task that had to be done twice a day, no matter what, was milking the cows. This task took a long time and was usually left for the children to do. Once the milk was collected, the milk that was not drunk was either made into cheese or butter. Making cheese involved a slow process of boiling and cooling the milk to produce curds or clumps of sour milk that looked sort of like cottage cheese. These curds were pressed into forms to make the cheese. Okay, so long ago, there were no grocery stores where you could just push your shopping cart around and put cheese in the cart. If you were alive hundreds of years ago, how did you get milk or eggs or cheese? What did you do? Say it out loud. Talk to your family about it. Okay, now this is going to tell you how people got butter a long time ago. To make butter, milk was left to sit until the fatty cream floated to the top. Then the cream was poured into a tall wooden container called a churn. A child usually had to pump the handle of the butter churn, called the dasher, up and down for a long time until the fat and the cream separated into butter. The leftover liquid, called buttermilk, was used for cooking or drinking. Okay, so parents, again, your kids might have trouble understanding how people churn butter, so you might want to look up a quick YouTube video to give them a better idea of what that would be like. And then that's your answer for number 3. Where did the cheese and butter come from? Where did cheese and butter come from? I guess you could say, what animal did they come from? Okay. All right. Next. People in the country ate mostly vegetables and grains. They only ate meat if the men or nearby neighbors had butchered or killed one of their animals. Because there were no refrigerators, the meat had to be preserved so that it would not spoil or go bad. This was done by hanging it in strips over the fire or in a separate shed like this one called a smokehouse. The smoke from the fire dried out the meat, which prevented spoiling. So the fire kept the meat from going bad. An example of a smoked meat that you might know is beef jerky. Other foods were preserved by covering them in salt, canning them, or storing them in a cool, dark cellar. Canning means sealing food tightly in jars so that no air can get in. After all those chores were done, it was time for sewing. In colonial times, women had to make their own thread and cloth before they could sew anything. Men and boys picked cotton from the fields and sheared the sheep. Okay, so remember I taught you that cotton grows in fields and you would have to pick it to make your clothes. We also learned that a sheep is an animal that is covered in wool. So it would be someone's job to shear the sheep or cut off the wool and then use the sheep's wool to make clothes. And the women would also dye this cotton or wool so that it would be different colors. So something that might help you understand that is maybe if you've dyed Easter eggs for this past Easter, you took the eggs and you put it in bowls of different colored dye to make it change colors. Well, people would take the wool and they would dye it so that it could be different colors so that they could have prettier, nicer clothes. Then women made the cotton or wool into thread or yarn, and after that they would weave the yarn into cloth so that it could be used to make clothing like pants or shirts or a jacket. Girls were taught to sew and weave usually before the age of 10 so that they could help make their own clothes. Because it was so much work to make clothes and so expensive to buy new clothes in town, much of the sewing work was patching or fixing old clothes that had become worn out and had holes or tears. Okay, so that goes to number 4 right here. Long ago, it was very expensive to buy clothes. So how did people get clothes? What did they do? You could say they would blank. Okay. Last page here. Because children were expected to help out with every one of these chores, they did not have a lot of time to play. So think about it. I bet you guys have time to play every single day. Well, back then, these kids had jobs they had to do, so they didn't have time to play as much as you guys did. So they didn't have many toys, but the toys that they did have, they would have to make themselves. Sometimes girls made dolls like these out of parts of a corn plant, and sometimes boys carved small toys out of wood. Most boys worked the farm alongside their fathers, taking over the family farm when they got older. If the family lived near a large town, some boys only lived at home until they were 11 or 12 years old. Then they were expected to learn a trade or a special job. Each boy would become an apprentice for several years, working with a master tradesperson in town to learn his job. The country family in colonial times worked hard every day. Sometimes a trip into town was a welcome relief or a break from their daily tasks or jobs. In town, the family was able to trade or buy things they needed so that they could save the time and effort it took to make them. In the next read aloud, you will hear about what happened when a farmer took a trip into town. Okay, so that's the end of today's read aloud. A few more questions for you to think about with your family though. One is, in colonial times, what kinds of chores did the children have to do? Okay, so if you were alive hundreds of years ago, what were some of the jobs that you had to do? Talk to your family about that. Okay. And then, was the farm we heard about in the read aloud a farm that existed a long time ago, or is it one that you would have today? There were lots of clues that should tell you the answer to that. Did these farms exist a long time ago, or would they exist today? And how do you know? Okay. So you have one more question answered for your journal prompt. It says, how is your life different from someone living in colonial times? So you could say, my life is different because... All right. I know you guys are getting tons of practice with your writing by doing these note catchers and by doing these journal prompts. So I want to say thank you for that. Parents, I know it's really hard to see your kids spelling things wrong, but try your best to kind of like let them try spelling things on their own. Like try to let them stretch out the words and listen to the sounds and write what they hear. Of course, if your child is really, really struggling, then help them out. Sight words, you can't really stretch them out because it wouldn't make any sense, but you can help them with those sight words definitely. Okay? Hope you guys enjoyed the read aloud today. Have a good day. Bye.